Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Bon après-midi. Welcome to our session, our learning event on the U.S. Constitution. My name is Taiki Sarantakis. I am the president of the Canada School of Public Service, and we welcome you today along with 5,000 of your closest friends who are, for the most part, Canada's public servants, but I'm told that we have viewers today from 7 different countries. So I don't know if you're at embassies somewhere or if you're just kind of hanging on as somebody else, but in any event, welcome. So a constitution, what is a constitution? There are a multiplicity of definitions of a constitution. My favorite definition is the one that says that a constitution is something that recognizes that there are some decisions that are too important to be left to those that just happen to be walking around. And that's really important for today's discussion, because what that implies is a constitution isn't just a set of rules, but that a constitution is also a set of values that are supposed to endure over time, that you're kind of binding future generations in a way to what you believe. And so in a way, it's in some ways, it's more akin to a little bit of a religious, it's more akin to a religious experience in some ways than it is to an administrative document of governance, because binding people over time is basically saying, I today am more important than you in the future, and I know better than you in the future, and I don't want you to kind of take these decisions. I will take them for you, even though I will never live the consequences of these decisions. So we have with us today a wonderful guide for our discussion on the U.S. Constitution. We have Sue Legan, who is a long-time professor of and student and scholar of the U.S. Constitution at Georgetown University. And for those of you who know Georgetown, you know what it's about. And for those of you that don't, it is where all the cool eggheads that are interested in U.S. government hang out. And for most of its history, Georgetown and Harvard have had people go in and out of government and in and out of academia back and forth. So we are very, very privileged to have Sue with us today. So Sue's going to do a little bit of a presentation on the U.S. Constitution. During the course of the presentation, you're welcome to ask questions. So there's a little, there's kind of a hand feature for you to ask, and then that'll get filtered back to me, and somebody will pick like the top kind of 3, 4, 5, 6 questions as we go along, and we'll slip those into Sue at the end. So in addition to Sue giving her presentation, I will jump in here or there as little as possible with just the odd clarification for a Canadian audience, and just the odd to give kind of the counterpart in the Canadian sense to what Sue is presenting, because at the end of the day, Sue isn't presenting a Canadian-American comparison. She's presenting the U.S. Constitution with the odd aside about Canada. So it's better for us as a Canadian audience to really learn a couple of those key differences that you need as policy and program analysts going forward in this very, very crazy world. So with that, I turn the floor over to Professor Sue Legan. Sue.
Thank you, Taiki, and good afternoon all, or good morning all, depending on your time zone. It's an honor to have the chance to speak with you today. And I want to begin by wishing you a happy U.S. fiscal new year. As of last night, our Congress has decided that the U.S. government will not shut down, at least not before December 11th. So that's good news on my end. I've told Taiki I wish we had a day and a half instead of an hour and a half for this, but you have my notes. And again, I welcome your questions. Don't be shy. If we can start with my very first slide, Christiana, that'd be great. There we go. I'd like to point out that the bottom document, which is the Constitution, is a direct result of the top document, which is the U.S. Declaration of Independence. And I'm really only going to tell you three critically important things. The rest is all embroidery today. The critically important things are the U.S. rebelled against Britain, unlike Canada. The second thing is that we are deliberately not a parliamentary system. Gridlock is almost inherent in the U.S. system, and there are reasons for that. And third, the U.S. states, the 50 states, came before the country and in many ways matter more to most Americans than the national identity does. So we'll get to all of those things. But let me begin with our next slide. And this is a serious question. These terrified people on the bottom, what were the founders so afraid of? You know, what was their concern and what was their objective? And did they achieve their goal? Well, I'm going to tell you about the first two in a second, but I would have to say, yes, they did achieve their primary goal. So let's go to the next one. The Constitution in the U.S. is designed to limit government. It's not designed to empower. It's not designed for coherent national policy. It is a document that was written in 1787. The U.S. Revolution was 1776. For 10 years, the U.S. operated under Articles of Confederation, but they had a very weak national government. In fact, it was just a legislative branch. There was no executive. Any law it passed required the assent of 9 of the 13 original states. Any change in that system required universal approval of all 13 states. And within 10 years, it became clear that this wasn't working out very well at all. And so they got together in Philadelphia in 1787 to write the Constitution, which is the same one we have today. It is the longest written constitution in continuous operation in the world. It's been amended 27 times, but it's something that Americans take very seriously. And Tyke is right. I suppose we could think of it almost like a civic religion in the U.S. It's the one thing that all Americans have in common. When you take an oath of citizenship in the United States, you pledge to defend the Constitution of the United States from all enemies, foreign and domestic, as opposed to the Canadian oath of citizenship in which you pledge your allegiance to the Queen. So again, the U.S. rebelled. We have a deep anti-monarchical streak in our political culture. That said, we love the Queen. We follow everything the royal family does. But, to the founders, King George III symbolized pretty much everything that was wrong with Britain treating the American colonies in a really pretty poor way. No representation in Parliament, imposing lots of really unfair sorts of the Stamp Act, I think of, unfair things, taxes and that sort of thing. So the list of grievances is pretty much what the Declaration of Independence is. It tries to justify what was an illegal act, breaking off from your colonial ruler. So you understand why we don't want a king, but you think, well, then why don't you have a parliament, which seems to make sense in so many nations of the world. And that brings me to my next slide. There's a reason we don't have a parliament, and that's because the people who wrote the Constitution were familiar with English history. This gentleman in the slide here is Oliver Cromwell, who was the legislator par excellence. He went to all the right schools. He was a military hero. He had been a public servant for years. I mean, if you could write the resume for someone to be the perfect legislator, Oliver Cromwell would have been it. And yet, over a period of time, he becomes the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth, which really is a sort of a dictator who doesn't wear a crown. So concern was you don't want to have concentrations of power anywhere. And one of the ways to do that would be to separate the legislative and executive roles. And I want to spend a second explaining this because this is often really baffling. In Canada, as in most parliamentary systems, the legislative branch chooses its prime minister to serve as head of government, if not head of state. So you think, well, that makes sense. Then you're guaranteed at least some modicum of cooperation. In the US, that would be investing too much power in a single individual. And that makes the founders a little bit nervous. So let's continue on that same slide, if you don't mind, Chris, with the next couple of points, because these are the things I think that are most different and most surprising. In the US, we have fixed terms and fixed dates of elections. If it is an even numbered year in the United States, there will be an election on the Tuesday following the first Monday in November. We can predict them as far out as the nation endures. We also have fixed terms of office for our members of Congress. And technically, Congress is comprised of both the House of Representatives, the equivalent to your House of Commons, and the US Senate. One difference, though, is that our senators are also elected. They're not appointed. So fixed terms for all of them. For a representative, the term is 2 years. So all 435 are up for re-election in a few weeks. In the Senate, their term is 6 years, but the terms are staggered such that only 1/3 of the membership is up for re-election in a given 2-year cycle. For president, by the way, the term is 4 years. So differing terms. That's important, but nowhere near as important as the next point. We don't have any votes of no confidence. Unlike in Canada and other parliamentary systems, the legislature cannot tell the prime minister, or in our case, the president, we've had enough. We no longer have confidence in you. It's time to form a new government. Oh no, we are stuck with each other essentially until the next fixed election. On the flip side, we also don't have the ability for the president to dissolve the Congress, unlike the prime minister who can call for new elections and dissolve parliament. So I think that's a very significant difference. We are not a parliamentary system. We are designed to limit government. As the founders put it, that government is best that governs least. Leave everything up to the private sector, or if you have to have government, have it be at the level closest to the people. So the state level or the local government rather than the national government. As I have said many times.
Jump in for a second.
Sure.
I'm going to jump in to let you catch your breath. And I'm going to emphasize a couple of the points that Sue said in the Canadian context. So our prime minister comes from the legislature. So the prime minister is one of 200, and I think it's 38 right now. That changes. But our prime minister actually sits in the legislative branch of government, as does his or her ministry, the Minister of Transport, the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Infrastructure. All of those people are in the legislative branch. In the American system, that's not the case at all. You have legislatures, people who sit in the legislature, and then you have the executive. And the executive is actually kind of what we think of as government. The legislature kind of says to parliament or says to government, you can do something or you can't do something. or we will give you an appropriation or we will not give you an appropriation. In the US, the people in the government are outside of the legislature. So their equivalent of cabinet ministers are actually not elected. Their equivalent of people that run the government are not people that are drawn from the legislature. So that's a very, very big difference. The second is the notion of the crown. As Sue told you, in 1776, the Americans did an illegal act, a profoundly illegal act. They basically said, we are doing a definitive break with the current constitutional order. We want nothing to do with you. We are rebelling. We are going into a revolution. We are writing our own rules. Canada has never done that. Canada has always been and continues today under the notion of the crown. Now, what it means to be under a crown has changed over the years, but we still have the crown. Back to you, Sue.
Thanks. Absolutely. In fact, it goes even farther than that in the U.S. Constitution, because we have constitutional provisions that expressly forbid individuals from serving in more than one branch of government at the same time. So you can't serve in local government and in the House of Representatives, for example. You can't serve in both. And the obvious question I've heard many times from Canadian audiences is then, well, how do you get any cooperation? How do you develop expertise? What informs decision making? And the response is, you don't always get cooperation. But remember, to the founders, that would have been okay. This is an 18th century mentality, not designed for a 21st century superpower. To them, that government is best that governs least. On the other side of that, you can say anything that does manage to be enacted in the US actually enjoys considerable compliance. We've seen that from all three of our branches of government, and I'll have some examples for you here in just a second. But when we talk about separation of powers, it's really more accurate to talk about interdependence of separate powers. For example, it is the president who appoints the top ministers of the government. We call them secretaries. We have 14 cabinet departments, equivalent to many of your ministries. We also have what we call agency administrators. Agencies are somewhat smaller, but independent of cabinet departments, things like NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. It is the president who appoints the head of all of those, but in order to be confirmed, those nominees require what the Constitution calls the advice and consent of the Senate, meaning the Senate has to approve. So a nice example of just how dependent they are. Likewise, it is the Congress that can create new departments. They can do away with departments and agencies. They can consolidate them. Sometimes combining numerous agencies. The most recent example we have would be our Department of Homeland Security, something that was stood up after 9/11 and combined 22 different government entities into one. So let's go to the next slide, because this one's sort of counterintuitive, I think. This is a chart that shows the polarization in the House of Representatives between 1960 and 2018. And what those bottom colors represent there are crossovers between Republicans, who we depict usually as red in the US, if you've heard the term red states or blue states. Democrats we depict as blue. It used to be that there were many Republicans who were ideologically more liberal than many Democrats. Likewise, Democrats, particularly in the South in the US, who were more conservative than many Republicans. But as you notice, those numbers really diverge. And the numbers on the side indicate the number of which Congress we're in. So we're currently in the 116th Congress. The Congress lasts for 2 years. We've had them ever since the Constitution was ratified in 1789. So if you do the math, you will see that the incoming Congress this January will be the 117th Congress. My point with this slide, though, is that I would say a lot of the problems we have in Washington these days are because we don't have a parliamentary system, but our political parties are behaving as if we do have a parliamentary system. And party discipline in the US has grown much stronger than it used to be. And with it, polarization between the two major parties. And that brings me to the question that I always get, which is, why don't you have more than two parties in a country of 330 million people? The answer is we do. We refer to any of the parties that aren't Republicans or Democrats as third parties, independent parties, and we do. We have a Green Party, we have a Libertarian Party, we have several different parties. But in terms of those that are going to matter at the national level, it's really the two-party system, which has proven remarkably resilient. Now, every so often after an election blowout, someone pronounces one of the two parties dead. And it's like the phoenix from mythology that rises, from the ashes to be stronger than ever. So we are likely to have two parties going forward, at least in the foreseeable future. I should point out that this Congress, the 116th, is more polarized than any Congress since the U.S. Civil War in the 1860s. So this chart only goes to 1960. But again, you would have seen that those columns separate a little bit more if we went back all the way. Let's go to the next slide and talk about one of the primary ways the founders prevented concentrations of power. And first, I should say that this gentleman with the nice hair is not an American founder, nor is he really an English statesman. In fact, this is Sir Isaac Newton. And I would suggest that the US system of government really owes a debt to Sir Isaac Newton and the notion of equilibrium and balance, and that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Those who wrote the US Constitution were students of the Enlightenment. They were familiar with this idea, and they decided to use it when they set up the government under the Constitution. And the three branches we have are very similar to the three branches in a lot of countries, where we have an executive, a singular president, a representative body in the Congress, and a Supreme Court, or a judicial system, judicial branch. Each of them in the US system has its own unique feature. For the legislative branch, its feature is that it is representative. It's difficult to be representative when you are an individual member of Congress, like an individual MP, and you represent about 700,000 people, which is what the numbers come out to. Since 1929, we've had the same number, 435. And those 435 members are reallocated every 10 years according to the census, something that's also in the Constitution that says we should conduct a census of the people every 10 years. So what happens is every state is dealt at least one representative, even the small states that don't have 700,000 people. Everyone gets at least one representative, and then the rest are apportioned according to numbers. So we see population shifts, and in the US, the trend has been from the Northeast and the Midwest, what we call the Rust Belt, to the Sun Belt, the South and the Southwest. And that pattern has been going on for about 50 years now. It's less pronounced than it had been, but you do see some states losing population and others gaining population. And in the past, some of the big losers have been states like New York and Ohio, and some of the big gainers have been Texas and Florida. So that has political implications as well, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. The role for the executive is to be decisive. And again, this was a stretch for a lot of people who were still very nervous about the danger of a monarch, not having had an executive under the Articles of Confederation. They decide there should be someone in government who can act decisively. And that's the reason that we have a singular executive. You know, some have proposed, why don't we have one president for domestic affairs and one for foreign affairs? An interesting notion. There's no reason the Constitution couldn't be amended to do just that. But throughout our history, we've seen the advantage in having one person held responsible or held accountable. In the words of Harry Truman, the buck stops here. This is the ultimate responsibility.
And we'll pause for a moment, Sue, and we'll ask Chris to put that slide back on, because this is another very, very profound difference between Canada and the United States. This notion of the separation of powers. And you have a system in the United States that is set up, as Sue has said, explicitly so that people are kind of fighting, so that this branch is balancing this branch, which is balancing off that branch. So the US, by design, it's supposed to be very difficult to get something done. So when you kind of see the gridlock, and as a Canadian, you kind of look at that and go, oh my gosh, what's going on down there? It's actually working the way it's supposed to work, which is to say, the president can't do something really easily without the Congress, and the Congress or the legislative branch can't do something really easily without the president. In Canada, we have the flip side, where in the United States, they're marked by the separation of powers. Our founders believed in the concentration of power. They believed that it was very, very important that government could do things a lot more easily than it could in the United States. And for those of you that remember when Canada was born, not in terms of having lived it, but from the history books, the Canadian Constitution was affirmed in 1867, which means it was being drafted and debated when a major, major event was happening in the United States, which was just a little bit below us, or below the 4 provinces at the time, and that was the US Civil War. And the US Civil War was horrific to the Canadian founders because they looked down south and they said, oh my God, this is what happens when you don't have a strong national government. This is what happens when the subnational units, the states, are very powerful. And so we, on purpose, concentrated power, where the Americans, on purpose, separated power.
It's absolutely right. Another thing that is unique in the U.S. is the status we give our judicial system. The judiciary in the U.S. really is a co-equal branch of government. And once again, life is imitating my lecture notes as the focus is on the Supreme Court this week after the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the president's appointment of a new justice who would need to be confirmed by the Senate. A little tricky in that we're in the middle of an election season. And so there's a lot of controversy about whether the president should wait until after the election, whether the Senate should wait after the election. Many in the Senate took that view when President Obama appointed someone to fill a vacancy, and the leadership in the Senate decided to let that ride for 10 months. So again, this is all very real, the things that we're talking about. If you look at the front page of any newspaper, you will see references to things like separation of powers or federalism. It's very much still present. If we go to the next slide, we can see the ways that our founders took this idea of dividing power and they ran with it. Federalism, as we'll talk about in a minute, the functional division between legislative, executive, and judicial, and then the decision as to who should be in the legislative branch. Because when the Constitution was written, the 13 original states, formerly colonies, reluctantly surrendered a little bit of their sovereignty to this new national government. And they did so in areas that would benefit from economies of scale. But it now became important to decide what should be the basis of representation in the national legislature. And the states with the largest population said, easy, representation should be based on population. That's the fair way to do it. But the small states say, oh no, we would be a permanent minority. That's not fair. We all come to this as states. So each state should be entitled to equal representation. And the compromise that evolved from this was, well, let's do both. So we have a House of Representatives based on population. 435 voting members. We also have 6 delegates from the U.S. territories, including, by the way, the District of Columbia, which does not have voting representation in Congress, but Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, American Samoa, Guam, have a representative who can serve in the legislative branch but can't vote on passage of legislation. So I like to say they're represented right up until the time that it might matter. But that being said, representation is going to be based on both. Then we're going to have different term lengths, 2 years for the House, 6 years for the Senate, 4 years for the President. We're going to have different constituencies. So in the House, you represent a smaller, sometimes more homogeneous area. Generally, in a House district, you might be an entirely suburban district or a rural district, or your entire district might be comprised of a few city blocks, for example. Whereas the state, for the senators, is going to be a more diverse constituency. And then, of course, the nation for the president. Fixed terms, we're going to have some fixed terms. We're also going to have lifetime appointments for the judiciary. And this is the judiciary's big perk. To insulate it from politics, or as kids in the US are taught, so it can do what is right rather than what is popular, the judiciary enjoys lifetime appointment. Actually, the term in the Constitution is that federal judges serve during good behavior, which I always think is really just a step away from at the king's pleasure, which is what it had been in Britain. So during good behavior really does mean lifetime appointment. You can be impeached, of course, for malfeasance. But as we've just seen, there's no mandatory retirement age for federal judges. Justice Ginsburg was 87. And I should point out, probably sharper than I am in terms of mental acuity. But in Canada, your judges have to retire at 75. Not so in the US. So that will be an area I suspect you will be hearing more about. Should we have mandatory retirement ages? Should we maybe have a fixed term for the judiciary? Understand that to do that would require a constitutional amendment. So it wouldn't be easy. But there's one proposal now that's sort of interesting, saying, well, you know, the Constitution says that you're entitled to serve as a judge, but it doesn't say you're entitled to serve on the Supreme Court. So maybe after 18 years, you go back and serve from time to time on a circuit court, for example. Some very interesting proposals being thrown around right now.
Now, Sue, I got to pause you for a minute because you've said some stuff that fascinates a Canadian audience. So you vote for your Congress, you vote for your senator, you vote for your president, then you vote for your state senator, then you vote for your state governor, then you vote for your local government, but you vote for your congressperson every 2 years, and you vote for your senator every, how often? 6 years?
Mm-hmm.
But not all of them at the same time because they're split up, and some of them, and then you vote for the president. You're always voting when you get anything done. Like, and how is it that you're constantly voting? And why do some people have 2-year terms and some people have 6-year terms and some people have 4-year terms? Like, to a Canadian mind, that doesn't make any sense. Can you demystify that for us?
You know, I got to tell you, to a 21st century American mind, it doesn't make any sense either. But to the 18th century mind of the founders, it all springs from this desire to prevent concentrations of power. So initially, one of the proposals was to have representatives chosen every single year. And it was Alexander Hamilton who said, that's ridiculous. You would have people come in to the legislature, and just when they were learning what they were doing, it would be time to go back home to their cows, as he put it. So 2 years was considered a tight enough leash to keep representatives accountable to the public, but long enough that perhaps they could get something done. Same with the why they have different terms and the fact that they're stuck with each other. Exactly same idea, prevent concentrations of power. So let's go to the next slide. And I know to a Canadian audience, I don't need to explain what checks are, just like in hockey, a means of stopping something. Americans refer to checks and balances as the way to operationalize this separation of powers. Give each branch a way to stop the other two, and give each branch something that the other two covet. In fact, James Madison, one of the authors of the Constitution, used the word jealous in describing the branches. Give each something that the other wants. A very modern notion of human nature, rather than trying to inculcate some source of virtue. He says, look, we know how people are. They're all power hungry. Let's give each something that the other one does not have. So let me very quickly run through some of the powers the legislative branch has, and that's the next slide. The power to tax, of course, critically important, and something that before the Constitution was the purview of each individual state. The states all had their own currency. They imposed tariffs on each other's products. So this was an area where the national government is going to be given the ability to tax and raise revenue. And with that revenue, they're also given that bag of money there, the appropriations power, what we refer to as the power of the purse. Every penny in the United States has to be appropriated, or as the Constitution says, the result of appropriations made in law. It is Congress that funds everything. And a lot of international visitors seem to think the president has some kind of slush fund for other projects. Everything that is spent has to be appropriated by the Congress, and that's a tremendously important power. The next one would be infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, canals, certainly very important in the early years. It is also Congress that is in charge of maintaining an army and raising a navy. Congress has authority to regulate commerce, and this is an interesting one. Not only does it mean regulating commerce among foreign nations or among different Indian tribes, what you would refer to as First Nations. All that's in the Constitution, but it also says regulating commerce among the states. And a lot of Congress's power in the 20th and 21st century has come from the court giving a very generous reading to the Commerce Clause. It's what American media will refer to as 183, which just means Article 1 of the Constitution, Section 8, Clause 3, but a very significant power. It also gives Congress the power to establish a national currency. and it gives Congress power over post offices and a host of other things. The little elastic band there is designed to illustrate the elastic clause, we call it. The last clause in Section 8 of the Constitution says Congress can do whatever is necessary and proper to carry out the foregoing powers. So, for example, if you're going to establish currency and you're going to spend money and you're going to tax, something that was determined as necessary and proper would be establishing a national bank, for example. Let's go to the next one. So this is a unique feature, and it's one you're going to be hearing about a lot, I suspect, fairly soon, and I want to make sure you understand it. In the Senate, though not in the House, there is a technique used where a senator can talk a bill to death. Again, in the Senate, all of the states are represented equally. So great big California, that has more constituents than the entire nation of Canada, has the same representation in the Senate as tiny little Wyoming, which has just under 600,000 people. And you think, well, that hardly seems fair. Again, the Senate was not designed to be representative. That's the House. The Senate is designed to represent the states equally. And by the way, there's only one provision in the U.S. Constitution that cannot be amended. We'll talk about the amendment process in a minute, but the amendment process specifies what you need to go through to make a change. The only thing you cannot change is equal representation of the states in the Senate without the states' consent. So it is with us, I would suggest, to stay, like it or not. So let's go back to the filibuster there, and let me explain more of how it actually works. The Senate doesn't refer to the word filibuster anywhere in its rules. It's certainly not in the Constitution. The idea is what they call unlimited debate. The Senate thinks of itself as a deliberative body that should leave no stone unturned. And if it takes a while to make sure that legislation is going to be okay, well, then it takes a while. In recent years, the Senate's pace has been glacial. Certainly much slower, I think, than even the founders would have expected. But the filibuster in practice means that an individual senator can prevent a vote from coming up simply by continuing to talk. And in 1917, the Senate changed its rules to provide for cloture. I always think of this like a clam closing, for cloture, a way to get a senator to sit down and be quiet. And cloture required at that time a 2/3 vote. It was modified in 1974 to require a 3/5 vote. So 3/5 of 100 would be 60 votes. That's the reason sometimes in the US you will hear about a supermajority being necessary in the Senate. Another way of looking at that is if you are in the minority party and you have at least 41 votes, you can prevent a vote from taking place because you can defeat any cloture motion. And we have seen filibusters and cloture motions go through the roof in recent years. As I put it.
So basically, Sue, not only now do you have all these divided institutions, now you're telling us that even within the institution, having a majority within the institution isn't good enough. So I'm going to actually jump ahead to our first question here because it's right on point, which is, how can this go on? Like, how can you in the 21st century, and I'm reading from our question because it's going to be the hardest one you're going to answer all day, which is, how can you in the 21st century have a system of government that can't deal with things rapidly as they emerge, i.e., a pandemic or a national emergency. How can you have so much division where you end up having paralysis?
What a great question. And certainly one that a lot of Americans are grappling with right now. With regard to the pandemic, remember I mentioned that the president is designed to be decisive and singular. I think sometimes the personnel are more important than the institutional powers. And I think this is one in which the president made the decision to downplay the pandemic. American response to other things has been much swifter, if you look at other pandemics, as has been support from the public. So I think you raise a really good point about how can this continue, but I wouldn't lay the blame here at the feet of the institution. And again, I hope I'm going to be able to say the same thing after our next election. You know, we expect peaceful transition of power in the United States, and we've had it since 1800. If different parties are elected, or even if someone from the same party comes in. So I hope that that will be the case, but it's an excellent question, and frankly, one to which I don't have a really sound answer. With respect to the Senate being sort of having a minority veto, that I do have an answer for. And hypothetically, if Democrats retake control of the Senate, which is currently controlled by Republicans, the president's party, if Democrats retake control of the Senate, there's going to be enormous pressure to do away with the filibuster, because they don't want to see their agenda stymied by the minority. And this is a big step if they do away with the filibuster. They've already lowered the threshold for cloture to 51 votes. Democrats did that with lower court judges during the Obama years and saw a lot of Obama judges confirmed. Republicans did it at the beginning of Trump's term in office and saw a lot of Republican judges notably go on to the Supreme Court. So we've already lowered that threshold. Same for cabinet level secretaries. You only need 51, not 60, but you still need 60 to overcome a legislative filibuster. If, on the other hand, a newly elected president sets forth an agenda and a minority of the Senate, which is already sort of a minority institution to begin with. Remember, the Senate represents states. So as we say, it is better at representing trees than representing people. You know, it is true that about half the Senate represents about a quarter of the US population. So again, this gives people hives if they're concerned about representative government. With the filibuster, it is entirely likely that Democrats will face too much pressure and they will say, we got to do away with it altogether. In some ways, that's a shame, as it has been, in my view, with judges, because it means you don't need any buy-in from the other party. It's been a while since we've had a filibuster-proof majority. Democrats had one not too terribly long ago, meaning 60 votes or more in the Senate. I think this is one area that is really ripe for change. And some see the filibuster as a key principle in the Senate, and others see it as giving the minority a veto that the founders never intended. So again, that's a hotter issue than many realize. Let's go to the next one, and let me just mention quickly some limits on the legislative branch. So we've already talked about the numbers of length for terms. In the House, 435 members, and I've just given you the current numbers of where we are right now. We have one independent who used to be a Republican, and we have 4 vacant seats. In the Senate, we are 53-47 if we count the 2 nominally independent senators, Angus King of Maine and Bernie Sanders of Vermont, who vote with the Democrats. So I call them Democrats. This year in the Senate, it just happens that 23 of the senators running for re-election are Republican, and I say running for re-election, some have retired, but they are Republican-held seats now, whereas only 12 are Democrats. In the last election, the reverse was true. Remember, only a third of the Senate is up for re-election at any given time. The idea there is the founders recognized there has to be some continuity in government. And in their view, it should be the Senate that continues. Presidents can come and go, but the Senate is a continuous body. The most important thing to say here, though, is that everything Congress does must trace authority to Article 1 of the Constitution. Everything has to be justified by the Constitution. When we talk about the first few words of the Constitution, our sovereign is we the people. And we the people delegate certain powers to the national government. The other powers that the states retain we call reserved powers. And this is more than just a semantic difference. You can only do something if you're authorized to do it. In other words, good public policy is not a sufficient justification in the US. You have to trace it to a constitutional provision. There are a few things I should point out that Congress is forbidden from doing. It's not something we think about too much, but it's worth mentioning. One is Congress cannot grant titles of nobility. Again, the early American obsession with not having anything monarchical. Likewise, Congress can't enact ex post facto laws. So something can't be made a crime that wasn't a crime at the time it was committed. And we don't have any bills of attainder, the biblical notion of the sins of the father being visited upon the son, or the example we always use is debtor's prison in England. You know, if your father dies in debt, you assume those debts. So we don't have any of those. Next up is the executive branch. If we could have the next slide. And I want to go through these fairly quickly so that we can get to what you're perhaps most interested in, which is the bizarre way in which we elect presidents. But executive powers, I should mention, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, Chief Diplomat, that briefcase up in the upper right corner there is what we refer to as the nuclear football. It is the president who has the nuclear codes. The power of pardon, something that the president can exercise at his will, and this president certainly has, sort of an executive check on the judiciary, if you will. The president is the CEO of the government. The president also is the person who appoints the federal bench. That's Justice Ginsburg there on the bottom with a very young Bill Clinton, who just appointed her before. And then finally, what we call the bully pulpit. The president being the voice of the nation. In some ways, I would say the president derives considerable power from being head of state and head of government in the same person. And most presidents, when the going gets tough as head of government, they love to go overseas and be head of state. At least most presidents who appreciate multilateral activity have turned to that. So let's look at the next slide for some limits on the executive branch. They're up for re-election every 4 years, and this is an important limit that only came about in the 1930s. The Constitution was amended to say that presidents can only serve for 2 terms. So you can't be re-elected over and over and over. Unlike the House and the Senate, where you can be reelected as long as the voters will have you. But just as is the case with Congress needing to trace everything to Article 1, the president needs to trace everything to Article 2. Some other limitations: it is Congress that holds the purse strings. So the president can say what he would like to do, build a border wall on the southern border in the United States, and the Congress can say, no, you're not going to get the money to do that. Another thing that is something of a limitation on the executive is the fact that the executive branch, or what sometimes would be referred to as the bureaucracy, usually used as a pejorative in the US, sadly, what I will refer to as the professional civil service, the people who do the data collection and analysis, who actually enforce the policies, who have the institutional memory can be slow to move. And the president refers to this as the deep state. The fact is, most presidents have had a hard time getting the executive branch to move as quickly as they would like. Some have compared it to trying to turn an aircraft carrier. It can be done, but it's going to displace a lot of water and it's going to take a lot of time.
So we'll pause and do a few more differences with Canada, because this is another big, big difference. In Canada, we have a very strong executive, and by design, as long as the executive, which technically is called the Queen's Privy Council, the Prime Minister is actually virtually not mentioned at all in the Canadian Constitution. There is one fleeting reference to the Prime Minister in the Canadian Constitution, and that was added in the 1982 amendment to the Constitution, and it's a clause that's already passed, because it says something like, by a certain date, the Prime Minister shall convene a meeting of First Ministers. So the Queen's Privy Council is the executive, and as long as the executive maintains what's called the confidence of the House, the executive has a lot of power. The executive appoints ministers, gets rid of ministers, can create organizations. Sometimes they need legislation, but not always. They can create organizations before legislation passes. They can spend, in some cases, money before the legislature kind of gives them authority going forward. They can spend money that kind of the legislature de facto gives them after the fact approval. So huge, huge differences. The executive in Canada is very powerful compared to the executive in the United States. And the executive in the United States is explicitly, as Sue's been explaining, constrained and constrained and constrained, so they don't become a tyrant. So they don't become somebody that can do whatever he or she wants independent of the people. In Canada, as long as our executive maintains the confidence of the House, which is the proxy for the people, he or she has a great deal of institutional power.
It's a very important point, and also a very nice segue to what was on that last slide about treaties. Another way that the president is constrained in ways that most leaders are not. In the U.S., it is not the president who decides whether the U.S. will be a party to a treaty. It is actually the president who promulgates a treaty, but it has to be ratified by 2/3 of the Senate. And in addition to matters of war and peace, 2/3 of the Senate, again, remember, represents the states. In fact, it wasn't until 1917 that the Constitution was amended to make senators elected by popular vote. Until 1917, senators were chosen by their state legislatures, so they really represented the interests of the states. And with treaties, there was a lot of concern over trade agreements. You know, could a northern industrial state produce a president who would be interested in a treaty that might harm a southern agricultural state with their cotton exports, for example? So treaty making, again, is an area in which the president is constrained. Now, if the president decides that the U.S. should not enter into a treaty, and several come to mind in recent years, then the president doesn't have to engage in that. The Senate cannot force the executive to engage in treaties, sometimes much to the frustration of not only many in the Senate, but the American public. But that's the way we have it. Next, we go on to the judicial branch. And the judicial branch is described in Article 3 of the Constitution, and it's really brief. And that's because the founders pretty much understood the way courts should be set up, and they took the model directly from England, as did all of the states. We adopted English common law, and we acknowledged that one of the roles for the judiciary would be statutory construction, construe the statute, or say what the law means. And again, all 50 states have followed this model, with the exception of Louisiana. Louisiana has a French system. They imported Roman law for a lot of their state law. They also refer to parishes instead of counties, again, reflecting their ancestry. But at the national level, there wasn't much need to describe the courts. Something that is not in the Constitution is actually what gives the court system its power. One thing that gives it its power, I mentioned, was the life appointments. Note that in states, not all state judges are appointed. Some states have elected judiciaries, some have appointed judiciaries. That's a state matter to determine. But at the federal level, since 1803, the courts have been able to exercise what's called judicial review. Again, you will search in vain to find the wording for this anywhere in the Constitution or in the Federalist Papers, which are the series of editorials that appeared in New York newspapers encouraging New York to ratify the Constitution. It means declaring an act of any other part of government unconstitutional and therefore null and void. Saying the Constitution is the rule book and we, the court, are the ones who interpret the rule book, even though that's not specified in the rule book. So tremendously important and something that the Supreme Court at the top of our judicial system will always make sure and review. If a lower court declares something unconstitutional, an act of the states or of the legislature or of the executive, the Supreme Court will want to standardize and make sure that it's not a lower court that's making such a momentous decision. Something that's very different from the Canadian system, and frankly, something I kind of regret, to be honest. In the US, the courts are not allowed to issue advisory opinions. So the president or Congress or states can't go to the court before enacting something or before taking an action and say, is this going to pass muster? In the US, we have what we call a case and controversy requirement that says there has to be an actual case between adversarial parties. You have to wait for a real case. And generally, there's not a problem in coming up with cases. In fact, there are lots of test cases that come up with a real controversy, but designed specifically to get at whether something is constitutional or not. But I think it's an important difference, and it would save a whole lot of time if our courts were allowed advisory opinions, but there you have it. The next slide is just a diagram of the federal judicial system. And the important thing to note here is that the US Supreme Court sits atop a state court system as well as the national court system. At the national level, we have 94 district courts. Those are the trial courts. There's one in each state. Larger states will have more. There are 13 courts of appeals, the intermediate appellate level, sometimes referred to as circuits. Circuits because in the old days when we didn't have enough judges, judges would literally ride circuit on horseback and visit different jurisdictions. And then at the top, the Supreme Court. The state courts are much more important than many realize because about 90% of all the laws in the US are state laws and not national laws. Pretty much anything that's going to affect an individual's life is going to be a matter of state law rather than a matter of national law. For example, criminal law, any of the awful things you can think of, like, murder or assault or arson, those are going to be tried in state courts, not national courts, unless they're committed on federal property, unless they involve terrorism. But in general, most of those things are going to be state things. Likewise, your curriculum in our public school system will be determined by your state. Some states are much better about foreign language instruction than others. Some require more science than others, for example. What they teach in terms of sex education differs tremendously by state. So some significant differences. My point with that is just that ultimately the Supreme Court has jurisdiction over state as well as national law and can declare acts of states unconstitutional as well. So let's get to the amendment process, the next one here. This is going to be the ultimate check on the judicial branch. If the judicial branch says we interpret the rule book, the amendment process says the people can amend the rule book. And there are two ways of doing it, though it's notable that only one has ever been used. The way to amend the Constitution is designed to be tough. In other words, if it's easy to amend, you start questioning the legitimacy of the document in the first place. Laws can be changed easily and superseded, but the Constitution, you really want to be careful in terms of amending. So the first method requires 2/3 of each chamber of Congress to pass a measure, and then it goes out to the states to ratify. And this is a really high hurdle. 3/4 of the states are required to ratify an amendment. The more relevant way to look at it, I think, is it takes just 13 states to block a constitutional amendment. And this is the way that all 27 have proceeded. Again, to appease the states, there is a way that state legislatures can be the initiating force, but we haven't seen that used before. So the founders expected probably that most change to the Constitution would come from amendment. The reality is there have been some important changes through amendment, but there have been a lot more that have come from Supreme Court interpretation. So if we can go to the next slide, Chris. Correcting some of the errors. For example, slavery, the 13th and 14th Amendments right after the American Civil War. Voting separately for the president and vice president. Those of you who are fans of the musical Hamilton, you've seen a little bit about this. This is sort of a technical correction. Prohibition, prohibiting the sale of and distribution of alcohol. 18th Amendment, which was repealed by the 21st Amendment. And then expanding the franchise, we call it, extending the vote to more and more people. Beginning with the 15th Amendment, 1868, to African American men, to women, the 19th Amendment, we're celebrating its anniversary this year. Residents of the District of Columbia in presidential elections. The District of Columbia is not a state. The Constitution says that states are entitled to electors in our electoral college. The District of Columbia wasn't. And even Congress decided, you know, that's really not fair. You have a jurisdiction that's going to have to live with whoever this person is, at least allow residents of the district to vote. Residents of the District of Columbia, which is what we call Washington, D.C., the Constitution specifies an area not more than 10 miles square. And if you look at a map, you will see a sort of a diamond shape with the Potomac River running through the bottom corner of it. Residents get to vote now in presidential. They do not have voting representation in Congress, something that means that the license plates on cars in DC have the motto, taxation without representation. Some refer to the District of Columbia as the last colony, for example. And then finally to 18 to 21-year-olds. It used to be that the vote was for 21-year-olds. This did not sit well during the Vietnam War, particularly when we had a mandatory draft. The idea being if you can be asked to carry a gun for your country, you ought to have a say in who is making the decisions of your country. So extending the franchise down to 18-year-olds.
So let's pause here. When Sue says how hard it is to amend the Constitution, she's not kidding. So the Constitution is over 200 years old. It's been amended 27 times, but not really. So here's how it's kind of the not really. The first 10 were the amendments to the Bill of Rights. So you could almost count that as one instead of 10. Then there's one right after the Civil War to end slavery, or was there two after Civil War?
There are three. The 13th Amendment ends slavery, 14th establishes citizenship, and then 15th gives men the vote.
So that's kind of two amendments.
Yeah.
So your Bill of Rights ending slavery. Then you've got this weird thing where it's like, it's illegal to drink alcohol. And then a couple years later, it's like, oh, okay, we'll let you drink alcohol. So that's kind of another amendment. And then it's like, well, like you said, like we should let the people in the District of Columbia vote. That's kind of silly. And then it's like, well, you know, like you said, if you're going to die for your country, let's let you have a drink before you die for your country. So the U.S. Constitution, in terms of formal amendments, gets changed very, very, very few times. It is in that sense a very static document.
I'm glad you brought up the Bill of Rights, too. Our first 10 amendments were ratified in 1791. Remember, the Constitution was ratified in 1789. And that was a condition for some of the states to ratify, who said, you know, we want a list of all the things the government can't do, because just because you've set up this separation of powers and federalism stuff doesn't mean that we are assured. And those who were supporters of the Constitution said, well, it goes without saying. And they said, nothing goes without saying. We want it in writing. And so some of the most cherished provisions to Americans of the Constitution are very similar to the things that you would have in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Freedom of conscience type things, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, for example. But throughout the Constitution, we don't have any group rights. We don't have any quotas in Congress for representation. You don't have to have a certain number of people from particular groups or anything like that. It's very focused on the individual and what the individual can do, as opposed to empowering the government to work for the social order. So if we can go back to that slide, I'm sorry, Christian, for making you jump around here, but if we can go back to that, I do think it's important to point out some of the things that have been done through the court's interpretation and not through amendment. Probably the biggest in 1803 was our fourth Supreme Court Chief Justice, John Marshall, declaring this power of judicial review, significant and elevating the judiciary to its co-equal status. Another one would be 1954, deciding that schools could not be segregated by race. Another would be allowing interracial couples to marry, something that only happened in the U.S. in 1967. Allowing same-sex couples to marry, something that only happened in the U.S. a couple of years ago. And something that just happened this year, forbidding discrimination in employment based on LGBTQ status. So with that, let's move on to federalism, because this is one of the more unique distinctions and one I think that's perhaps not as well understood. If you remember nothing else from what I say today, please remember this: the states came first. In fact, before the Civil War, proper English usage was the United States are. It was only after the Civil War that we started to say the United States is. And while that is a semantic difference, I think it's really important. The question early on was, would the country survive? Not would the states survive. So you see here the original 13 colonies that rebelled. The top one there, Maine, was not part of the original ones. Vermont was its own republic. Eventually, this map shows you the 50 states. You've got Hawaii there at the bottom and Alaska, the non-contiguous portion. But in all of them, there are certain powers that are reserved to the states. Remember, federal government has to have delegated power. So what's left? Everything else that's left is reserved to the states. In fact, If you read the 9th and 10th Amendments, part of the Bill of Rights, it says just because we've listed all these other things in the first 8 doesn't mean that there might not be other rights. And then the 10th says, and if there are, they belong to the states or the people. So, get your federal hands off of this stuff. Let's go to the next one.
Again, huge differences with Canada. For those of you who know your history and you see Sioux say the states came first, provinces also came first. But the difference is that provinces came before the federal government, but the provinces didn't rebel. The second is in our Constitution, if it's not clear who something belongs to, it actually belongs to the federal government, not to the state, not to the province. So our kind of default is the exact opposite of the US system. In the US system, the federal government only has that which is explicitly conferred on it. In the Canadian system, it was designed to be the opposite. It was designed to be, and if it's it's federal. Again, in large part because what was happening in the US at the time was a civil war, and the Canadian founders were very, very concerned about unrest and war amongst ourselves and provinces and the like. The third, if you think of just the semantics for a moment of what Sue said, the United States are versus the United States is, and that's a big difference. Think of the semantics between the English language meaning of the word state and the English language meaning of the word province. A state, the American subnational organization, is a state. A state is powerful. A state is autonomous. A state exists because to protect its people. In the ordinary English language term of the word province, a province is a bit of an insult in the ordinary usage of the term. You say provincial, which means kind of far away. It means kind of not sophisticated. It means, so even in that nomenclature, the subnational units in the states are states. The subnational units in Canada are provinces. And that again goes back to the notion of the crown, because we're all provincial in Canada, because the sophisticated state was back in Great Britain.
That's great. If we can go to the one that shows the delegated and reserved powers there. And again, I know this is difficult to read, but since you have access to these for reference later, once again, delegated powers on the left, reserved powers on the right, and then some things that are concurrent, like courts, like borrowing money, like infrastructure projects, for example. Both have powers. But reserved, there are a couple things that are really relevant, especially now. Note the first one, conduct elections. In fact, when we go to vote on election day, or if we vote beforehand and tally things up on election day, we do not have a national election. We have 51 simultaneous elections conducted in the states, and that's right in the Constitution. The time, place, and manner of elections is established by the states unless Congress acts to do something about it. And Congress did act to do something about it years and years ago to set election day in November. Again, primarily an agricultural society at the time. November was good because it fit well with the harvest and planting season. It wasn't yet so snowy, but it was post-harvest. We did it on a Tuesday because market day was Wednesday. The Sabbath was observed on Sundays by many people. So again, Congress established this November date. It's not in the Constitution. Establishing schools, though, again, really important in terms of what our children should be taught, something that is a very hot topic in some areas. Regulating businesses, like, say, should your bars stay closed because there's a pandemic? and you have seen over 200,000 people die of this pandemic, wouldn't it be a good idea to keep your bars closed? Well, apparently not so much in Florida, Indiana, and Tennessee, who have all seen spikes in their coronavirus cases, and the states decide they are going to be the ones who regulate business by deciding what is open and what isn't. Establishing local governments, and this is important, states are not creatures of the national government. The national government can't subdivide states or combine them without risking another civil war. But local governments are the creatures of state governments, and some state governments give a lot of autonomy to local jurisdictions, others don't. It varies tremendously across the country. Regulating marriages, another one that has taken on particular relevance for me, I am happy to say, in that my daughter, who is a doctor in Boston, is getting married to a Canadian who is a doctor in New Hampshire, who has family in Toronto and Montreal. I'm in Virginia, and we're trying to figure out how are we going to do this and when are we going to do this? Again, because of travel restrictions and so forth, it becomes relevant. Some states, we learn, have different regulations for how you have to apply to get married and so forth. So some of these things are simple, but to most Americans, they are going to encounter them more readily than they would encounter delegated powers of the national government. Just a simple, but I think important point. So to illustrate, again, conveniently, life imitates my notes. Let's go to the next one that shows which states currently require masks. And you can see some of them, they're sort of widely distributed. The coasts, with the exception of the South there, tend to require masks. Some of the heartland doesn't. A couple places don't at all. Again, it varies. There is no national policy. There could be a national policy here. This is one where it really is up to the president to decide and to set an example, and that's just not been the case. So that leaves this decision to the governors to decide which states are going to require masks. The next one is another timely example. How are we going to vote this election? Some people don't want to go to the polls as they traditionally would. Election day is a holiday in some states. It is not a holiday in others, but employers are required to give people at least 2 hours off of work so that they can go and vote. More and more states are deciding to make it a holiday. But this shows you something else. This shows you where can you mail in your vote without an excuse. In all of the blue colored states, you can mail in your vote for any reason this year. And again, the reason many states have adopted this policy is because of COVID. In the red colored states, you have to have a reason. And, being afraid of being infected by a really nasty pathogen is not a sufficient reason in those states. You have to have another reason. And then in the purple states, you don't even have to ask. You get a ballot mailed to you, whether you want one or not, and then it's your choice to fill it in. So again, the states came first. The states matter. And that brings me to the next slide, which is one.
Sue,
sure.
I'm going to stop you here. And we're going to do three things, one of which is unprecedented. So the first is we're going to invite you back because we're running out of time, and we want to do two more things with you. The first is we want you to explain this beast called the Electoral College, because you have a big event coming on November 3rd. And it's really, really interesting the way that you decide this big event. It's the Electoral College. And to the Canadian mind, it's like nuclear fission. It is inordinately difficult for us to understand and comprehend. So we're going to invite you back. And given that you're on live TV, you can't say no. So because it's live. So we will set up and we will have a session that's dedicated exclusively to two things. The first is the Electoral College, and then the second is everybody's questions. So because you're so good at explaining in plain language things that are very, very mystical to a lot of Canadians, we are getting lit up with questions here. And I think it's just a shame to not use your expertise to just kind of let people have an open floor and ask questions. So we will invite you back in the next couple of weeks to demystify the Electoral College for us and to take open questions. The second thing I want to point out is something that Sue has said that's extraordinary, and I just want to make sure for those of you that might have missed it, I want to really hammer it home. There is no equivalent of Elections Canada in the United States. There is no body that oversees the US election, that is the referee, that says, here are the voting hours, here's the ballot, whether it's electronic or mail or tick or check or X. All of those things are left to each of the states to determine. And in fact, some of the states even let their counties, their local governments, decide those things. So there is no national election oversight in the US. Eventually, some things go to the Supreme Court, which is kind of the national arbiter, but there is no entity that oversees the US national election like there is in Canada. When you vote in Canada for your federal representatives, it is the federal system that sets up kind of a body and rules under which that federal election is run. And then the last thing, Sue, I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you in 3 minutes to give us a philosophical answer to one of the best philosophical questions I've ever received. And this is from our audience. And you have spent a great deal of time telling us how the US Constitution was drafted in order to avoid tyranny by preventing the concentration of power between institutions. However, within institutions, you have very powerful figures. How do you explain the roles of the leaders of the House of the Representatives and the leader of the Senate? How do Americans tolerate this concentration of power and unlimited election cycles in the Senate and in the Congress where they don't tolerate that in their president?
I love this question. In fact, I wish I had more than 3 minutes, but let me give it a go. The Congress part is pretty easy to answer. If you look at the last 6, and I looked this up, if you look at the last 6 election cycles in the US, we have elected 50 or more new representatives each cycle. So here I'm going to say the founders would be happy. We do it the old-fashioned way. You boot them, throw the rascals out, as we'd say. In the Senate, interestingly, the Senate Majority Leader is considered a very powerful position. It is nowhere in the Constitution or the Senate's rules. It's something that was set up by precedent. It is not a constitutional office. So the Majority Leader traditionally is voted on by the majority party, but at any time, if the majority party loses confidence, they can replace the Majority Leader, which I think is interesting. Technically, the head of the Senate is the Vice President of the United States. The Vice President of the United States, as President of the Senate, has one important job, and that is to cast tie-breaking votes. This could become relevant. And it gets even more interesting when you talk about what happens if you have an election where no one gets a majority of electoral votes. It goes to the House of Representatives. Each state gets 1 vote, but I'm getting ahead of myself. That's all for the Electoral College talk. The concentrations within, I think, are a question that has come up an awful lot, particularly in this administration. We've seen the president do things that presidents before have never attempted. And to a remarkable degree, the Senate which is dominated by the president's party, has allowed the president to do some things that are currently pending before the court. There are at least 7 cases involving the president that are before the Supreme Court for review. All presidents have cases that go to court, but this is a sort of an unusual circumstance. In the House of Representatives, it is doing what happens in what we call divided government. When at least one chamber is not of the president's party, you get some pretty strong oversight. And you can see this just by looking at the titles of hearings. Doesn't matter if it's Democrats in the White House or Republicans in the White House, whichever the other party is will really call them to task. And so the role of oversight is an important one. Unified government, I think this question becomes even more relevant. If you have House, Senate, and White House of the same party, who is doing the checking here? Because everybody wants to make your own party look good. The only comfort I take is that since 1992, there have only been 4 years when Democrats had unified government and only 6 when Republicans had unified government. So divided government is the norm, as if we've learned the founders' lessons almost too well. And that is in part what accounts for gridlock.
Sue Legon, retired professor at Georgetown University, thank you for these last 90 minutes. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for being a friend of the Canadian Public Service. And thank you for accepting to come back to tell us a little bit more about this beast called the Electoral College in the next couple of weeks. Thank you, Sue. We'll see you.
It'll be my pleasure. Thank you.
Take care.